It took an entire full day to realize my little brother had gone missing. Growing up, he was always a quiet kid. He barely had any presence in any situation. He was never picked on in school for being quiet, nor was he treated any differently than the other kids when people paid attention to him. But that was just it. People rarely noticed him. During the time in which this event occurred, he was only 10 years old while I was only a couple years older. Even though we were roughly the same age, my parents entrusted his welfare solely to me. I'll admit, at first, I absolutely hated it. Whenever my brother would get into trouble or break something, or generally have any type of problem, I would end up paying for it. The very first instance of this was when he broke his television. I was in the other room playing on my Nintendo that my parents had bought for me. My father was at work and my mother was busy cleaning our house. Suddenly, without warning, a loud crash resonated from my brother's room. My mother went rushing in there and found that he had somehow turned his television completely around, and it fell off his dresser. After checking to make sure he was all right, she came barging into my room to yell at me for not keeping an eye on him. I was confused by this, as I hadn't previously been told to babysit him before. My mother's response was, "You're old enough to have responsibilities. Your brother is now one of them." After that, I tried my best to keep a close watch on him. We went to the same school, and that made things quite a bit easier on me. I didn't have to constantly be around him all the time guarding him. Mostly it was just when we would walk to and from school together. The walk to school was a long one. It would sometimes take us a half hour just to make it there. My family only had one car and my father used it for work every day. And once my brother and I were semi-competent as far as children go, we walked to school on our own. In hindsight, that probably wasn't very smart on my parents' part, but we didn't know any better. The school wasn't very far from our house, geographically speaking. If we walked directly to school, it would probably take us 5 to 10 minutes tops. However, there was a large forest surrounding the outskirts of the school, between my house and the school itself. My parents forbade us ever to step foot in that forest. The way my parents warned us about those woods was somewhat strange. It didn't just seem like they were worried about poison ivy or simply getting lost. It seemed like there was something else. Regardless, the route that we had to take around the entire forest increased our travel time tremendously. My brother and I would have to wake up incredibly early just to get ready to leave so we could be at school on time. Then, after school, we'd begin our leisurely trek back home. This went on for a few years until that day happened. My friends had been talking about a new game they had just gotten and had been bragging to me about it for an entire month. I had desperately wanted to play it. So one day after school, my friends invited me over to hang out. As we were leaving, my little brother was tagging along, until one of my friends mentioned not wanting to hang out with a little kid. Telling my little brother to go home on his own is my biggest regret, but it's something I have to live with. My brother didn't argue or protest. He simply said, "All right," and we all parted ways. I didn't make it home until late in the evening. I walked in through the front door and tossed my bag on the couch. My mother greeted me and asked me where my brother was. Before I responded, I felt a pit rapidly growing in my stomach. I told her that I went to a friend's house and that he should have been home by now. But he never made it home. The first few days were the roughest. My father beat me relentlessly and my mother never stopped crying. My parents got the entire town involved in the search. After a week of combing through the woods while I was confined to my room, the search turned up nothing. My father began drinking heavily, while my mother became a shut-in. Even though my parents were having a rough time, I think I was having the worst of it. The guilt I felt for telling my brother to go home that day ate away at me. I couldn't sleep, eat, or even think about anything, and it never got better. During the first month, my parents refused to give up. My father would drive around the woods every night, and my mother would post flyers around town. I was forbidden to leave my room, unless it was to go to school, and only then would my father drop me off and pick me back up. I helped my parents as best I could, even though I could see the resentment in their eyes. They hated me for what I had done. I hated me. But I helped my mother print out flyers. The teachers allowed me to use the copier in the lounge. I used to hate going to school and love staying at home. But now it was the complete opposite. School felt happy and warm. Everyone was so kind to me, even though it was obviously born out of pity, while my home life was broken and cold. After the second month, the efforts began to wane. My mother stopped posting flyers, but my father still committed himself to driving around every other night searching for him. My mom actually started to realize how hard my life had been and began to see that I was suffering as well. She told me she didn't hate me for what had happened, that it was an accident. I know that it was hard for her to say that, but still it made me feel better at least. 6 months had passed. Our family was slowly starting to rebuild our lives. My mother even began smiling again. My father still drank, but he did his best not to let it consume him. He still worked full-time and kept a roof over our heads. The day my little brother came home, I'll never forget it. I was sitting in class near a window, mindlessly working on a worksheet the teacher had given out. My gaze lazily drifted from my paper to the window, letting my mind wander out of boredom. When I saw him, my brother was standing on the edge of the tree line, just staring at the school. Once I realized what I was seeing, I jumped up so fast it sent my desk tumbling forward towards the ground. The crash made my entire class, including my teacher, look up at me. I didn't say a word. I didn't ask permission. I didn't even look at anyone. I just ran out of the classroom, down the hall, and tore through the main doors as fast as I could. During this time, I remember praying that he wasn't just a hallucination. I rounded the nearby perimeter fence of the school and then I saw him. He was standing in the same exact spot as before. I ran into him so hard it almost sent him flying, if not for my arms wrapping around him as tight as I could. I looked at him with tears in my eyes, scanning him for any sign of injury. I couldn't come up with any words to say to him other than, "I'm sorry." He didn't say anything back, but I just assumed it was because of shock. By that time, my teacher had seen what had happened and phoned the police, as well as my parents. My brother was taken to a nearby hospital with my mother in tow. She started crying again, only this time it was tears of joy. He spent an entire week there while the doctors ran numerous tests on him. Though what was odd was that, apart from some minor bruises and a few small cuts, my brother was perfectly fine. Well, fine for someone who had been missing half a year. He wasn't even malnourished or dehydrated at all. Even though on the surface he seemed reasonably alright, underneath, mainly his mind, I could tell something was wrong. My little brother didn't speak for an entire month after we had found him. He would wake up in the morning, eat breakfast, go to his room, and just sit on his bed all day staring out of his window. Everyone just assumed it was PTSD. He had suffered a very traumatic experience. No one could blame him. But to me, something wasn't quite right. I knew he was always quiet, but the way he looked out of the window wasn't the vacant stare of a broken person. It was like he was looking for something. Or someone. I remember the first time he spoke to me. I was sleeping, and around 3 a.m. I was awoken by a sharp poke to my shoulder. My eyes slowly cracked open and I saw my brother standing over me. I asked him if everything was all right. What he said to me sent a shiver down my spine. He said, "They are coming," before screaming at the top of his lungs and dashing back to his room. I quickly followed and found him hiding under his bed, shaking. Over the years, his trauma got better. It even got to the point where most people remember something happening in the past, but not much else. My brother slowly recovered and now leads a very normal life. He even has a wife now. I myself am living alone, just trying to get by day. Normally, I would let this experience fade from memory, if only to absolve me of my mistake I made all those years ago. But last night, I was awoken by my phone ringing. When I answered it, I heard nothing for a moment before a voice crackled through the receiver. "They are here," the voice said. It was my brother. I asked him if everything was alright, but the line abruptly went dead. It's been a full week and nobody has seen my brother or his wife since. Everyone at their work seems to think they just went on a vacation. But I know the truth. He went back to those woods. If you find yourself walking near a forest at night, keep your distance. You never know who or what could be in the darkness, waiting to steal you away.